Imagine a corporation invading a country and almost keeping it. In the 1600s, the Dutch West India Company wasn't just trading sugar, it was waging corporate war. Backed by investors, armed fleets, and ledgers, it seized Brazil's sugar coast in 1630, turning the colony into a boardroom run by muskets. For nearly 25 years, the Dutch ruled Brazil's richest lands like a profit-driven empire, exporting sweetness and blood in equal measure. At its center stood Count Maurice of Nassau, a visionary who brought tolerance, science, and urban planning, all while his company fueled Europe's wars with Brazilian wealth. But the locals fought back, uniting Portuguese settlers, indigenous allies, and African soldiers in a rebellion that rewrote the map. This is how the story of a corporate conquest shaped colonial strategy, and how Brazil's unity was first written in sugar, not gold or silver. Before Portugal, the land we call Brazil was already busy. Forests stretched over river basins the size of countries, and along them lived thousands of indigenous nations connected by footpaths, waterways, and shared rituals. Communities built longhouses near fertile clearings, timed planting with river cycles, and moved seasonally to balance soil health and game migration. Far from empty, these regions threaded together by trade and kinship made a continent-sized network that adapted to rainforest, savanna, and coastline. Diversity defined it. Scholars count more than 2,000 distinct tribes over centuries, speaking hundreds of languages and dialects. Among them, Tupi speakers clustered along the Atlantic fringe, their canoes moving between lagoons and estuaries. The Guarani ranged further south and inland, building villages that linked river valleys through kin alliances and exchange. Tapuia, a Tupi term, labeled inland groups outside Tupi speech zones, a catch-all for many peoples with their own systems of law, warfare, and belief. These labels point to influence, not homogeneity. Local rules, taboos, and leadership styles shifted from village to village. Agriculture anchored daily life. Farmers used controlled burning to open small plots in the forest, plant manioc, maize, beans, and squash, and then let fields lie fallow to regenerate. Fishing teams read river levels like calendars, setting weirs and nets when spawning seasons peaked. Coastal families harvested shellfish and sea turtles, dried fish for storage, and exchanged salt and smoked meat inland for ceramics, pigments, and stone tools. The myth of untouched wilderness falls apart when you see orchards of managed palms, earthworks guiding water, and foot trails linking markets. Social systems were complex. Some groups practiced ritual cannibalism after warfare, not as spectacle, but as a spiritual transaction that framed courage, reciprocity, and the closing of cycles of vengeance. Captives could be adopted, ransomed, or killed within rules that communities understood as justice. Feasting, oratory, and song shaped these events, embedding warfare within ethical codes rather than unchecked brutality. Leadership emerged from persuasion as much as lineage, where chiefs mediated disputes and hosted exchanges to keep alliances alive. Environment drew hard lines between lifestyles. In the rainforest, long-distance travel followed rivers, so canoe building and navigation knowledge carried high status. On the coast, wind, tide, and reef patterns set the rhythms of fishing and seasonal gatherings. Inland plateaus favored larger gardens and hunting circuits that turned on grassland fires and animal behavior. Technology matched terrain. Hardwood bows for forest hunts, big dugouts for mangrove channels, and woven fish traps tuned to local streams. There are also controversial but fascinating theories about visitors before 1500. Some writers point to currents that could have carried Phoenician or Roman-era sailors west, or Norse wayfarers pushing farther south than known routes, or African navigators tapping Atlantic winds. Evidence remains debated, so treat it as a possibility, not proof. What is clear are traces of ancient engineering in the western Amazon that challenge old assumptions about sparsely settled forests. In Acre, massive earthworks, precise circles and squares cut into clay, appear from the air as geometric signatures. These geoglyphs suggest coordinated labor, planning, and ritual spaces embedded in an engineered landscape. Roads, ditches, and mounds align with each other, hinting at settlement clusters that manage soils and waters on a scale once thought unlikely for the region. This points to indigenous societies capable of organizing labor and knowledge across generations, centuries before Europeans crossed the Atlantic. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral steered a convoy southwest to catch Atlantic currents, then veered farther west than planned. What later looked like a neat arc on a chart became an historic accident. Landfall on a coast unknown to Europe's royal maps. After weeks at sea, the ships anchored off a sheltered shore in present-day Bahia, a stretch of sand and forest the crew flagged as Porto Seguro. The first act on land set the tone of a spiritual encounter. Sailors raised a wooden cross, and clergy organized a mass under an open sky. The ritual mattered to the crown, which had granted Portugal the right and duty to spread the faith alongside trade. The beachhead mixed ceremony and reconnaissance. Carpenters cut timber for repairs. Water casks filled from streams. Officers noted safe anchorages and reefs. Everything pointed to a quick stop, not a colony. Early judgments ranked the find below the target. Cabral's orders aimed at spices and textiles in the Indian Ocean, where profits were proven and treaties already negotiated. This coast offered no cloves or pepper, and Lisbon's councils did not rush to pour money into a vast, uncertain shore. So the crown treated it as a service station: fresh water, food, and soon a source of dyewood. Ships would cruise by, load, and go. Brazil wood, or pau-brasil, turned the shoreline from waypoint to workshop. Its heartwood produced a rich red used in European cloth, and cutters learned to fell, split, and stack it for transport. Small trading posts dotted safe coves where middlemen coordinated crews and guarded stockpiles. The tree gave the land a commodity identity, and eventually a name. The extraction ran on seasonal cycles, with flotillas timing departures to beat storms and hit Atlantic winds that could shave weeks off the return. Contact with coastal peoples began as cautious exchange. Canoes approached. Gifts moved both ways: metal tools for food, trinkets for information. Gestures and signs built temporary alliances that let Europeans camp, harvest wood, and sail away without fighting. But the asymmetry sat in the background. Metal blades altered local power. Diseases would follow, and the transactional mindset that treated forests and people as inputs seeded future abuses. Portugal's attention stayed fixed on the east. The Estado da India, the network of forts and factories from East Africa to the Spice Islands, demanded ships, captains, and money. Lisbon allocated Brazil only patrols, trading licenses, and a few expeditions to map stretches of coast. Enforcement against French interlopers was sporadic, and the Crown kept administration thin to save costs. Loose supervision defined the first decades. One small detail hints at priorities. Cabral's convoy carried more priests than soldiers, a ratio that underscored the weight given to sacraments and conversion over garrisons at this early stage. Another visitor stamped the new shore on maps. In 1501, Amerigo Vespucci sailed along the coastline, noted bays and river mouths, and circulated accounts that called it the Land of the True Cross, a devotional label that sat well with Iberian courts. French corsairs started showing up where Portuguese patrols were thin, trading with coastal groups and loading Brazil wood in coves the crown barely knew. Raids by other Europeans followed, and complaints stacked up in Lisbon. Unguarded harbors, lost taxes, and foreign flags testing a long shoreline. The message landed. Treat Brazil as a real possession or risk watching rivals carve it up. King João III answered with an experiment in off-budget colonization. In 1534, he carved the coast into 15 hereditary captaincies and handed them to donatarios, nobles and military men who got vast tracts plus rights to collect dues, distribute land, and establish towns. In return, they had to recruit settlers, raise defenses, evangelize, and make the place pay without draining the royal treasury. Each captaincy ran deep inland from a coastal strip, a map that promised order on paper while leaving logistics to private initiative. Reality chewed through those paper lines. Many captaincies faltered under the same mix of blows: hostile incursions by rival Europeans, determined indigenous resistance, shipwrecks that stranded supplies, and fevers that thinned crews before planting seasons. Distance from Lisbon slowed every plea for tools, livestock, or soldiers. Some guarantees never even reached their concessions. Others landed, built a fort and a chapel, then watched their ventures whittle down to a few timber sheds. Two places escaped that pattern. Pernambuco and São Vicente found production models that stuck. Pernambuco's soil and climate welcomed cane, and planters built engenhos, sugar mills that drew capital, skilled workers, and maritime attention. Farther south, São Vicente turned into a foothold for exploration and farming that could feed settlers as they pushed inland. Their relative success pulled ships their way and created nodes of authority where so many other grants had only markers on a chart. Martim Afonso de Sousa gave São Vicente its start in 1532. His expedition laid out streets, parceled land, and set up a council to regulate daily life. He pushed for mills, planted provisions, and tried to set rules for trade with nearby villages. That framework, town, council, fields, and a watch on the bay, became a template for later attempts to turn coastlines into communities rather than seasonal camps. Even the best-run posts struggled. The coast stretched for thousands of kilometers, and inland routes crossed unfamiliar territory where alliances shifted quickly. Tropical diseases ripped through crews unused to the climate. Supply ships came late or not at all. Without a central hand, each captaincy bargained alone, fought alone, and reinvented solutions its neighbors already had, which wasted time and lives. Labor needs drove early exploration. Colonists forced indigenous captives into clearing fields, hauling cane, and cutting timber, often through raiding or by twisting alliances around Jesuit missions that sought to gather converts in settlements. Coercion built the first mills and farms long before enslaved Africans arrived in large numbers. The violence embedded in this system shaped how wealth accumulated and who bore the cost. The crown moved to impose order. In 1549, Governor-General Tomé de Souza founded Salvador on the Bay of All Saints as the first capital. From there, a centralized administration could appoint judges. coordinate defense, and standardize taxes. Convoys began to regroup shipping, garrisons got steadier pay, and letters from outlying captaincies had somewhere to land. Pernambuco's planters soon bragged their strip of coast was the richest under the sun, a nod to sugar money. Meanwhile, some failed donatarios bailed out, dumping rights and unworked tracts in improvised sales that looked like early real estate speculation. Amid chaos, cane fields multiplied, mills turned through the night, and a sugar economy started to knit scattered captaincies into a single Atlantic enterprise about to accelerate. By the early 1600s, cane fields carpeted the Northeast. Pernambuco and Bahia became production belts where plantations stretched from river mouths to low hills, each centered on an engenho, a mill complex with boiling houses, presses, and storehouses. Landowners carved estates along good soils and reliable water, then tied them to ports by ox cart roads and coastal barges. Harvests ran in cycles, cutting cane by hand, crushing it the same day, and boiling juice through a sequence of pans to crystallize sugar fit for export. Coordinated labor, predictable heat, and constant repairs kept the engines turning through long nights. Sugar rose as white gold because it paid in hard currency. European demand climbed with habits formed in kitchens, apothecaries, and taverns, and the Portuguese crown tapped that demand with taxes on every shipment. Merchants financed harvests months in advance, took cargoes on consignment, and hedged risk by loading different grades: loaf, muscovado, and syrup. With each convoy, Lisbon counted customs, and planters settled debts and ordered tools, iron, and cloth for the next season. Profit rode on timing and volume. The foundation was forced labor. Across the 17th century, Brazil brought in more enslaved Africans than any other colony in the Americas. Slave ships linked West and Central African ports to Salvador and Recife, offloading men, women, and children sold into work gangs that cleared forest, planted cane, cut wood for the furnaces, and carried loads to the wharf. Mortality was high from overwork, disease, and punishment. Blight, sabotage, and organized resistance formed the other side of that ledger, as people found ways to slow production, escape into forests, or defend marooned communities. Hierarchy on the plantation set roles and privileges. At the top, senhores de engenho combined land, capital, and political clout. Below them, overseers enforced schedules and quotas. Skilled workers, boilers, carpenters, blacksmiths, often held different treatment because breakdowns threatened the whole season. Most enslaved people worked fields from dawn to night, housed in barracks and subject to strict codes. Sundays and religious festivals offered brief windows for markets, family ties, and communal rights. Across coastal towns, African cultures took root under pressure. Languages, drum patterns, and foodways blended into new forms. Early candomblé took shape as ritual houses gathered Orisha worship, healing, and mutual aid, often under the cover of Catholic brotherhoods. Dishes like acarajé and stews built on palm oil, okra, and cassava crossed from plantation kitchens into urban life. Music and dance carried memory and offered a framework for dignity and solidarity that slavery tried to crush. Jesuit missions advanced inland at the same time. Missionaries gathered indigenous families into aldeias, taught catechism, and pushed agriculture and crafts. Their defense of mission communities from slaving raids created constant friction with colonists who wanted labor and land. In council chambers, the argument over souls, sovereignty, and property played out as lawsuits, royal directives, and occasional expulsions or returns. Salvador and Recife turned into busy Atlantic hubs. Warehouses stacked sugar, tobacco, and hides. Markets sold tools, fabrics, and imported wine. Shipyards patched caravels and built coastal craft. Brokers matched cargo with hulls, secured insurance, and prepared manifests for convoys that sailed with escorts to reduce piracy risk. News and goods moved in both directions, stitching Brazil into a global circuit. One plantation could endow a noble household for generations. And those mills ran on sophisticated water-power wooden machinery that demanded teams of artisans to maintain gears, troughs, and presses. The system worked, and it drew eyes from competitors. Across the sea, Dutch merchants and their war company watched the profits and mapped the weak points in the chain. Europe's contests spilled into the Atlantic when Portugal fell under Spanish rule in 1580, tying its empire to Spain's wars. Enemies of Madrid treated Portuguese outposts as fair game. Privateers tested Brazil's long coast, probed harbor defenses, and traded with planters who needed credit. The sugar trade, already valuable, looked exposed. In this climate, a new kind of aggressor emerged, a chartered company with warships and investors expecting dividends. The Dutch West India Company set its sight on the sugar belt. Built to raid Iberian shipping and seize colonies, the WIC mixed commerce and conquest under a corporate board. In 1624, its fleet struck Salvador, Brazil's first capital, taking the city after a brief siege. Officials fled inland. Storehouses, cannons, and records fell to the occupiers. Yet the hold proved thin. A joint Luso-Spanish force regrouped, cut supply lines, and retook Salvador within a year, showing that Brazil could still be defended when metropolitan and colonial resources pulled together. The Dutch recalculated and returned where profit was thickest. In 1630, they captured Recife and Olinda in Pernambuco, anchoring themselves in the richest sugar zone. This time, they fortified islands, dredged channels, and secured mills through mortgages and contracts. Planters under debt shipped sugar through Dutch agents, while the company tried to standardize prices, protect convoys, and keep refineries in Amsterdam fed. Control meant more than flags. It ran through credit, shipping schedules, and legal paperwork that bound harvests to the port. Administration shifted with the arrival of Count Johann Moritz of Nassau. He governed with a pragmatic style, paving streets, building bridges, and planning neighborhoods that improved traffic between warehouses and wharves. He recruited engineers to drain marshes and stabilize riverbanks, aiming to keep carts moving and ships loaded on time. He backed scholars and artists who cataloged flora, fauna, and people, tying knowledge production directly to governance. The mapping and art from this era stand out. Naturalists like Georg Markgraf compiled data on plants, animals, and climates that fed navigation and agriculture. Painters such as Franz Post produced cityscapes and rural scenes that recorded mills, waterways, and the layered society around them. These works doubled as propaganda and information, showing Europe a new Holland that looked orderly and profitable. Religious policy widened the city's population. Moritz permitted open worship, which drew Jewish merchants who organized trade and community life. In Recife, they established Kahal zur Israel, the first synagogue in the Americas, and joined a network that connected Brazil to Dutch, Iberian, and Caribbean markets. Tolerance here was not just principle, it knitted together capital and logistics essential to the sugar business. After Moritz was recalled, cohesion frayed. Credit tightened, taxes rose, and planter-company relations soured. Outside the fortified core, resistance expanded. Local militias reorganized, and Afro-Brazilian units and indigenous allies leveraged terrain knowledge to pressure outposts and patrols. The turning point came with the Battle of Guaranapes in 1648 and 1649, where mixed-force militias used broken ground, ambushes, and mobility to blunt Dutch formations and sap morale. By 1654, under siege and facing eroding support at home, the Dutch capitulated and evacuated Recife. Some settlers shifted north and later filtered into New Amsterdam's merchant world. Yet traces remained in Pernambuco, canal lines, drainage networks, and building methods that marked a Dutch chapter in the landscape. The companies left, the scars and skills stayed. The colonies stood harder and more integrated, and another lure began to glow inland as word spread of metal in the hills. Rumors moved faster than caravels. Traders in coastal taverns whispered about mountains that flashed in riverbeds, and claims spread inland along old indigenous paths. By the 1690s, obsession had a direction: the rugged highlands that settlers called the Gerais. Watercourses cut through dark soils, and specks in the pans told searchers they were not chasing myths. News kept pace with profit. Each small find pulled more men across the Sierra do Mar with tools, slaves, and debts. Bandeirantes from Sao Paulo pushed hardest. They were part raiders, part prospectors, used to long treks and hard bargains. Around 1690, their pans and crude sluices pulled grains from streams that fed the Rio das Velhas and Rio Doce. Camps became encampments, then regimented arraias with rules, guards, and way stations. A colony that once hugged the coast pivoted inland in months. Mules replaced coastal barges. Prices for tools and food spiked. Credit followed, and so did crown officials. Within a generation, Minas Gerais sat at the center of imperial attention. By the 18th century, Brazil's output neared half the world's supply, and Lisbon's court ran on the cash. Silver-poor Portugal suddenly had a balance sheet that impressed Europe's lenders. Coinage, jewelry, and remittances pulsed through convoys and escort fleets. Officials counted chests, audited receipts, and worried about leakage as smugglers learned every bend in the backcountry roads. Towns seemed to rise out of creek beds. Ouro Preto spread across broken hills and terraces, each slope crawling with diggings and scaffolds. Mariana and Sabará followed, drawn by veins that justified permanent streets, councils, and brotherhoods. Churches crowned the ridges. Inside, gold leaf coated carved altars, and painted ceilings glowed when candles burned during feast days. Processions wound through lanes cut into laterite, while tailings piled up at the edges of town. The shine in the sanctuaries hid the pit below. Enslaved Africans, bought at coastal markets and driven inland in coffles, stood waist-deep in cold water, panned gravel, and carried loads from galleries shored with rough timber. Floods collapsed shafts without warning. Lung disease, infections, and exhaustion took lives at a rate that planters and contractors priced into contracts. Some fled to form quilombos in remote valleys, trading with herders and attacking supply lines when they could. Lisbon tightened control with the Quinto do Ouro, the Royal Fifth. Officials demanded 20% of all gold and built the machinery to collect it. The Casa de Fundição system forced miners to bring metal to foundries where stamps fixed both purity and tax. Unmarked dust became contraband. Searches intensified. Patrols seized animals and arrested carriers, while amnesty offers tried to pull hidden stock back into legal channels. Despite controls, leakage thrived. Smugglers sewed dust into clothing seams, packed grains in image frames, and hid it in candles. Yet the flow that reached Europe still looked immense. Some historians argue that Brazilian gold helped finance London's rebuilding in the 18th century, as Portuguese payments and British loans braided into Atlantic finance. Inside Brazil, new roads linked Minas to Rio de Janeiro and to Sao Paulo, while a regular postal route cut travel times for orders and news. The backbone of a national network took shape on mining needs. Art kept pace with wealth. The Brazilian Baroque gave the towns a distinct face, and Alejandino's sculpted prophets and church fronts turned rough stone into lasting markers of the boom years. The cycle bred fortunes and anger in equal measure. As yields dipped and inspections grew harsher, resentment mounted. Reformers in Lisbon read the ledgers and saw both promise and leakage, and a new program of enlightened control prepared to bear down. Power consolidates in Lisbon when Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo rises as the Marquês de Pombal under King José I. He is not a court ornament, he acts as a manager-in-chief. After 1750, he takes hold of ministries, councils, and ports, knowing that the empire's solvency runs through Brazil's exports and taxes. When the 1755 Lisbon earthquake levels districts and sets the river on fire with ruptured oil stores, rebuilding demands cash, labor, and a disciplined state. Pombal makes Brazil the fiscal backbone, and he crafts laws to squeeze predictable revenue from a colony used to flexible arrangements. He redesigns administration with audits, censuses, and new paperwork that tracks cargoes from plantation to quay. Governors receive tighter instructions, and councils lose room to improvise. Customs officers gain authority to seal warehouses and impound contraband, while convoy schedules aim to cut insurance costs and piracy. The point is control. Fewer intermediaries, clearer routes for money to reach the treasury, and penalties that bite when rules are ignored. Local elites who once balanced smuggling with official trade find their margins squeezed by inspectors who now answer directly to the crown. State monopolies anchor the plan. The crown creates chartered companies to command circuits of people and goods. The Companhia Geral do Grão-Pará e Maranhão manages the northern trade, coordinating African slave shipments with Amazonian exports like cacao and drugs of the Sertão. The Companhia de Pernambuco e Paraíba focuses on the sugar coast, bundling credit, freight, and price setting under one corporate umbrella. Diamonds and gold face separate controls, with licensed districts, sealed packages, and royal agents posted at choke points. Monopolies compress profit into official channels, which stabilizes tax flows and makes credit cheaper for loyal traders. Trade law hardens along metropolitan lines. Portuguese-only navigation rules push foreign merchants out of Brazilian harbors and direct freight to Lisbon and Porto. Consulates police contracts. Marine insurance shifts to crown-approved brokers. At the same time, Pombal targets the Jesuits, who shield indigenous communities and challenge civil jurisdiction. In 1759, he expels the order from Portugal and its empire, seizing properties and schools. The removal shatters mission networks. Thousands of indigenous people lose legal and physical protection and are exposed to raids, forced relocations, and illegal enslavement despite formal bans. Education and bureaucracy move towards secular oversight. New curricula prioritize arithmetic, engineering basics, and practical language study to feed commerce and administration. Censorship boards vet books and pamphlets so that Enlightenment ideas come filtered, useful for governance, hazardous if they encourage dissent. Pombal sponsors technical training for surveyors and customs clerks, building a cadre that can count, measure, and report. He also intervenes in market behavior. In a pointed protest against rising prices, he bans Brazilian sugar at the royal court for a time, signaling to planters and dealers that speculation will meet regulatory pushback. His radical policies are instrumental and hierarchical. He formalizes the end of indigenous slavery to stabilize frontier relations and to channel labor disputes through civil courts. African slavery expands within the sanctioned trade, now organized through company fleets and licensed factors. The economy grows more integrated, yet social violence deepens where freed spaces vanish and enforcement tightens. Across parishes, audits of gold output, diamond fields under lock and registry, and company ships with scheduled arrivals make Brazil legible to Lisbon in new ways. The system works on paper and often in practice, but strain shows. As inspections multiply and monopolies crowd out local bankers, resentment builds in towns and plantations. Brazil becomes richer and angrier, and the wider world shifts again. Wars in Europe reorder alliances, and the upheavals unleashed by Napoleon will soon send a royal fleet west, turning Brazil from revenue source into royal refuge. Napoleon's troops crossed into Portugal in 1807, and the Braganza dynasty made a decision no European court had ever attempted: evacuate to Brazil under British naval protection. Convoys loaded with baggage, archives, and sacred objects pushed off from Lisbon as French columns crossed the roads. The Atlantic became a royal highway. Over 10,000 nobles, officials, artisans, and servants sailed with the court, turning a distant colony into the seat of a European monarchy. Weeks later, mass crowded Guanabara Bay, and the colonial harbor met a government in exile that planned to operate at full scale. Dom João, then Prince Regent, stepped ashore in Rio de Janeiro and began governing as if Lisbon's quays were just over the hill. Palaces and warehouses were requisitioned. Streets were cleared for processions and guard posts. The small administrative staff in Rio swelled overnight into ministries, tribunals, and councils. Royal charters moved with the court, so decrees carried the same force as in Portugal. Rio shifted from a sleepy entrepot to the imperial capital by order and habit, not ceremony alone. The first big policy stroke came quickly. In 1808, Dom João opened Brazilian ports to friendly nations, ending 3 centuries of exclusive trade through Lisbon and Porto. Customs officials rewrote ledgers, and British, American, and neutral ships queued for entry. Tariff schedules favored allies, and a surge in imports, textiles, ironware, tools, lowered costs for planters and merchants. Exports scaled up as sugar, cotton, hides, and, increasingly, coffee found buyers without metropolitan bottlenecks. The policy reset the economy, shifting Brazil from a captive supplier to a participant in wider markets. Institutions followed. A royal press began printing laws, gazettes, and technical manuals, cutting delays in communication and encouraging a literate bureaucracy. The Bank of Brazil opened to handle government finance, issue notes, and stabilize payments between merchants and the state. A botanical garden took shape as a living laboratory for acclimatizing useful plants and supporting agronomy. Each move aimed at basic state capacity: credit, information, and applied knowledge. Cultural life accelerated under patronage. Theaters received licenses and subsidies, academies trained artists and engineers, and the city's book trade expanded with legal presses and private importers. Brazil began to look and feel like a kingdom in place, with rights, uniforms, and paperwork to match. Behind the scenes, British influence grew. The Royal Navy shielded shipping, diplomatic envoys negotiated commercial treaties, and British merchants secured low tariffs in consular courts, making them the dominant partners in Rio's docks and counting houses. A curious outcome of the relocation was the scale of the royal household's library. Manuscripts and rare volumes salvaged from Lisbon swelled Rio's public collection into one of the largest in the Americas. The city also felt the sudden demographic shock. The arrival of officials and retainers effectively doubled the population for a time. Food prices spiked, housing tightened, and landlords split rooms into rentable corners as court demand outstripped supply. Local elites learned fast how to operate within the new order. Access to offices, contracts, and honors strengthened plantation barons and merchants who aligned with the court. Patronage flowed into provincial networks, and loyalty to a Brazilian capital, rather than a faraway Lisbon, reframed political identity. Conversations in salons and chambers turned from colonial grievances to questions of status and rights within an empire headquartered in their own city. As the wars in Europe wound down, pressure mounted for the king to return. His departure would pull the center of gravity back across the ocean, but the institutions he planted in Rio could not be packed into trunks. The court's Brazilian interlude had already rewired trade, administration, and ambition. The question that lingered was whether the new capital could go back to being a colony after governing as a kingdom. The Liberal Revolution of 1820 broke over Portugal and demanded a constitutional monarchy with authority restored in Lisbon. Committees in the capital drafted a charter, recalled exiled officials, and insisted that the Bragança court end its Brazilian residence. The demand struck at the new order that had grown in Rio. Ministries, banks, and presses worked there as if Brazil were a co-equal kingdom. Now the center of gravity was being pulled back across the Atlantic by a movement that promised law and limits on royal power. Dom João VI faced a choice between legitimacy at home and continuity abroad. In early 1821, he embarked for Lisbon with much of his household, leaving his son, Dom Pedro, to serve as regent. The prince was young, well known among Rio's elites, and tangled in loyalties. He owed obedience to his father and, at the same time, owed his position to the political base he had built in Brazil. As João's ships vanished over the horizon, local leaders wondered whether the next decrees from Lisbon would unwind everything achieved since 1808. The Cortes soon sent instructions that aimed to reassert colonial control. They ordered Pedro to return, downgraded Brazilian institutions, and planned to fold provincial administrations back under metropolitan ministries. Customs houses, courts, and army units received conflicting commands as new directives crossed existing practices. Merchants and planters who had prospered under open ports and royal favor feared losing contracts, titles, and the informal access that made business work. They wanted reform that affirmed rights without stripping local autonomy. Debate moved from salons into councils and militia barracks. Newspapers printed constitutional proposals alongside letters from plantation districts. Lawyers argued whether the old Union of Kingdoms allowed Brazil to keep institutions that Lisbon had not created. Clergy and brotherhoods held meetings to weigh oaths and responsibilities. Provincial juntas coordinated petitions that defended home rule while professing fidelity to the crown. The model took shape: accept constitutional limits, but keep Brazil's executive in Brazil. By early 1822, pressure on the regent sharpened. On January 9th, he announced he would remain, a decision remembered as Fico, aligning himself with leaders who insisted that Brazil manage its own government under a constitutional framework. Ministers resigned and were replaced with figures close to Brazilian interests. Provincial commanders received orders from Rio, not Lisbon. The court retooled the bureaucracy to answer locally and prepared for the possibility that negotiation would fail. Months of mobilization followed. Slogans turned to organizing. Volunteer battalions formed in coastal cities. Inland towns created committees to secure supply lines and coordinate messages. Pamphlets linked Enlightenment arguments about sovereignty to recent American and Latin experiences. The goal was to secure recognition without plunging into a long civil war that the economy could not bear. Still, skirmishes and standoffs flared where Portuguese garrisons held out and councils challenged Rio's authority. On September 7, 1822, near the Ipiranga River, the regent proclaimed Brazil's independence. Accounts suggest the day lacked heroic gloss. He was dusty, unwell, and riding with a small escort. Yet the act set a timeline in motion. New flags, decrees, and diplomatic notes sped to ports and provinces. Compared to neighbors, the split leaned on negotiation, recognition, and targeted force rather than years of nationwide campaigns. By the year's end, Dom Pedro accepted a crown and became Emperor Pedro I, giving the new state a monarchic frame born on American soil. The empire would need to consolidate power, secure borders, and find revenue, and the first tests arrived before the ink on proclamations had dried. Brazil stood on its own and crowned Dom Pedro I, a singular figure in the Americas, a monarch ruling an independent nation. The mood in Rio and major ports mixed ceremony with practical work. Diplomats sought recognition, provincial councils reorganized militias, and the court adjusted finances to cover loans taken during the separation. Newspapers praised unity, while merchants tracked exchange rates that determined whether customs revenue could pay soldiers and clerks. The new flag flew over a continental space, but building legitimacy required more than symbols. It needed stable accounts, working courts, and the confidence of provincial elites who held land, labor, and credit. Optimism collided with costs. Wartime spending and arrears from the transition strained the treasury. Revenue depended on customs and internal taxes that often arrived late from distant provinces. Contractors advanced pay to garrisons and then demanded compensation and privileges. Rio de Janeiro's central offices began issuing decrees that touched every province, and resentment grew as local leaders saw their budgets squeezed to service imperial commitments. The sense that Rio set policy while others paid the bill hardened into a political habit that would define the decade. Pedro himself carried a second burden: inheritance abroad. As heir to Portugal, he lived with the expectation that events in Lisbon could pull him into dynastic politics. Correspondence with Europe shaped appointments and foreign loans, while domestic factions debated whether an emperor with family claims overseas could keep Brazilian priorities first. This ambivalence surfaced in council debates, army promotions, and the tone of newspapers that backed provincial autonomy. In 1824, Pernambuco became the flashpoint. Federalist-minded leaders proposed a looser union and formed the Confederation of the Equator. Imperial forces marched, and the Navy enforced blockades. After brief campaigns, the government crushed the revolt, arrested leaders, and reaffirmed central authority. The outcome stabilized the map, but it left a record of grievances about tariffs, representation, and military command that did not vanish with the surrender. Diplomatic work moved in parallel. By 1825, Portugal recognized Brazil's independence, a result achieved with British mediation and a £2 million compensation that locked in debt obligations. Recognition opened formal trade and eased the work of consuls and insurers. It also tied fiscal policy to payments owed abroad, which kept pressure on customs houses just as the internal economy struggled to normalize. Inside the capital, politics grew rough. The Constituent Assembly worked on rules that would limit imperial authority and standardize provincial relations. Pedro's temperament, decisive and quick to confront, produced repeated clashes with deputies. Cabinet changes came fast. Street demonstrations grew. The scandal around his relationship with Domitila de Castro, the Marquesa de Santos, widened church-state tensions and provoked petitions from conservatives who linked moral order to political stability. Yet the institutional frame that emerged in 1824 carried an unusual mix: broad guarantees for religion and the press, and preserved powers for the crown. The emperor also left his signature in culture by composing the music for the first national anthem, aligning court ceremony with the new sovereignty. These gestures helped, but they did not quiet the drift of public opinion. Provincial newspapers criticized spending, garrisons muttered about arrears, and merchants complained about unpredictable policy. By 1831, protests coalesced into a crisis. Troop unrest and street pressure met a court weary of confrontation. Dom Pedro I abdicated in favor of his 5-year-old son, Dom Pedro II, and boarded a ship for Europe. Ministers stayed to keep payrolls moving and to hold the line while a regency learned to govern a restless empire. The throne sat empty in practice, and a regency tried to keep a sprawling empire stitched together. Councils in Rio issued decrees while provincial juntas bargained for troops and tax receipts. Governors rotated as factions in the capital split over how much power to concede to the interior. Trade still passed through Bahia, Rio, and São Luís, but convoys met checkpoints run by men who took orders from different masters. The structure looked constitutional on paper and improvised on the ground, which meant that timing payrolls or moving a garrison could depend on a local loan, not a national budget. Tension cracked where distance and grievance overlapped. The Cabanagem erupted in 1835 and bled for years as rebels seized Belém, armed river communities, and fought shifting coalitions of provincial and imperial forces. Death tolls climbed from the battle, disease and reprisals, and the river network that fed the Amazon trade turned into a chessboard of blockades and raids. In Maranhão, the Balaiada broke out in 1838, rallying artisans, vaqueros, and deserting soldiers against debt, conscription, and local elites. Cavalry columns spent years pushing bands into the backlands before authority reasserted itself. Far to the south, the Ragamuffin War began in 1835, as ranching elites in the Rio Grande do Sul challenged tariffs and central appointments. Militias rode open country, created a separatist administration, and fought a grinding campaign until negotiated settlement ended it a decade later. These uprisings unfolded alongside a national debate that hardened into party lines. Liberals argued that provincial assemblies should control police, taxes, and patronage, claiming that local knowledge kept order better than distant ministries. Conservatives countered that only a strong center could keep customs revenue flowing, secure borders, and standardize courts. Newspapers aligned with clubs and brotherhoods, and careers rose or fell with a governor's stance on provincial prerogatives. Behind rhetoric sat practical questions: who paid arrears, who appointed judges, and who commanded the garrison when streets filled? The Additional Act of 1834 tried to ease the pressure. It granted provincial assemblies broader powers over budgets and administration and created a new municipal framework. The move cooled some disputes, but also emboldened separatists who read autonomy as license. In practice, provinces used their new latitude to shape police forces and local taxes, while ministries wrestled with uneven compliance and gaps in revenue. The Regency added councils and reform statutes, yet it still had to rent loyalty with appointments and concessions when force could not reach. By the late 1830s, a solution many had dismissed gained traction: bring the emperor forward. The Golpe de Mayoridad in 1840 declared Dom Pedro II of age at 14. The ceremony gave the center a human face and a focal point for loyalty oaths, while allowing ministers to rebuild command chains that had frayed. The young ruler worked, read, and listened. Audiences stretched late, and correspondence piled high as he learned the map through petitions and reports rather than tours. Stability did not arrive overnight, but the tone shifted. Negotiations ended stalemates, amnesties folded rebels back into provincial life, and the army, reorganized under steadier funding, enforced settlements without the spectacle of mass reprisals. Courts regularized procedures, and roads and telegraph plans entered ministerial agendas. Dom Pedro II's reputation for languages and study, ranging from Hebrew to Sanskrit, signaled a methodical approach, and his interest in emerging technologies later drew official support for photography and telegraphy as tools for governance. By mid-century, the empire had moved from triage to consolidation, and the horizon widened toward expansion of commerce, infrastructure, and a calmer politics that would soon define a high tide. Under Dom Pedro II, the empire settled into a long stretch of order. Taxes came in, roads stayed open, and governors answered to a center that finally felt permanent. The court learned to plan beyond the next crisis. Bureaucrats mapped provinces, standardized weights and measures, and kept the customs houses busy. The army drilled, the navy patrolled, and the calendar filled with state visits and expositions that signaled a confident state. Coffee rewrote the map. Planters pushed into the Paraíba Valley and later into the highlands of São Paulo, carving rail beds to haul beans to Rio and Santos. With each harvest, new warehouses rose, banks extended credit, and insurance firms followed the crops. Freight agents, commission merchants, and dock crews found steady work. Coffee duty paid for bridges, piers, and street paving. City blocks near the port took on the look of commercial districts, counting houses in front, storerooms behind, clerks upstairs posting prices wired from abroad. The slave trade's closure in 1850 cut off the Atlantic pipeline, but did not end bondage. Planters turned inward, moving enslaved people from the Northeast to the coffee belt. Prices rose, families were split, and a domestic traffic bound the interior to coastal markets. Police watched for contraband ships while courts tried smugglers, but the plantation order held. At the same time, free labor expanded. Immigrant pioneers, first trickling in, then arriving in contracts, began to appear on coffee estates. Wage books, still thin, started to sit next to slave ledgers. Steam made the distance smaller. Side-wheelers pushed upriver, and coastal packets stitched together Belém, Salvador, Rio, and Porto Alegre. The first rail line opened in 1854 and kept growing outward, linking valleys to ports and easing the movement of troops, mail, and harvests. Telegraph wires caught up with the tracks and then outran them, letting presidents of provinces send orders in minutes instead of weeks. Schedules, rate charts, and printed timetables entered daily life. The empire spoke to itself more quickly. Rio changed. Theaters filled with season tickets. Medical schools trained a steady flow of doctors. Law students debated in cafes and took clerical jobs in ministries. The imperial court bought instruments, books, and lab equipment, and made a habit of inviting lecturers from abroad. Collected specimens landed in cabinets and gardens. Surveyors drew clean lines across maps that had been empty space. Abroad, Brazil played as the senior partner in the neighborhood. It sent warships to show the flag, negotiated river rights, and kept watch on borders from the Amazon to the Plata. Cadets trained with new rifles. Shipyards replanked corvettes and ordered iron hulls from overseas. The government signed loans in London, nursed its credit, and kept an eye on commodity prices that could swing budgets from surplus to deficit. The emperor liked devices and rewarded the people who built them. He walked factory floors, asked questions, and funded projects that linked science to trade. At one World's Fair, he stepped into rooms packed with machines and met the people advancing medicine and communication. Years earlier, when the first locomotives arrived, he did not just preside, he handled the controls for the inaugural run. For all the gloss, the foundation creaked. Enslaved labor still powered plantations, and a rising abolitionist current leaked from classrooms into newspapers and street meetings. Republican whispers threaded through officer clubs and Masonic lodges. And to the south, a conflict gathered force that would put all this organization to the test, from the railheads to the river gunboats. The order and confidence of the previous decade did not survive the border crisis. In 1864, Brazil's quarrels with Paraguay's neighbors pulled it into a coalition with Argentina and Uruguay against Francisco Solano Lopez. What began as a diplomatic standoff over river access and regime politics on the Rio de la Plata became a declared alliance once Paraguayan columns crossed into Mato Grosso and Corrientes. The timetable of peace, rail shipments, customs receipts, scheduled steamers, gave way to mobilization orders. Shipyards rushed hull repairs. Provincial presidents scrambled for recruits and supplies. The Navy concentrated on the Paraná and Paraguay rivers, where forts commanded bends and mud shoals trapped careless pilots. Lopez counted on speed and geography. He pushed through marsh and gallery forest, seeking to disrupt Brazilian communications and to force Argentina to negotiate on his terms. The plan faltered as the Allies pooled resources. Brazil's fleet, better armed and more numerous, probed upriver, while infantry slogged across wetlands that swallowed wagons and spread disease. Campaigns pivoted around river fortresses. Curupaiti's batteries, set low behind earthworks, shredded an Allied assault and stalled the advance for months. Humanaitá, a chain-draped bastion with guns commanding the channel, turned into a siege that tested engineers and sailors alike. Gunboats had to thread currents under fire, and pontoon bridges broke in storms. The cost mounted. Supply depots emptied faster than they filled. Hospitals overflowed with fever cases, dysentery, and wounds that festered in the heat. Brazil expanded recruitment beyond free volunteers. Enslaved men who enlisted in the army and navy units received promises of manumission on discharge, and thousands took that bargain. Provinces raised contingents, judges processed papers, and notaries recorded new names. The policy weakened plantation labor pools and pushed slave prices higher, tying the front to coffee districts hundreds of miles away. It also changed barracks life, as units mixed backgrounds and created new loyalties that outlived the campaign. Leadership hardened in the field. Luís Alves de Lima e Silva, later titled Duke of Caxias, imposed steady discipline, paced advances, and insisted on supply before assault. He wore down Paraguayan positions rather than chase quick glory. Officers learned to coordinate with the Navy, to build corduroy roads across swamps, and to keep artillery dry enough to fire after downpours. Dom Pedro II traveled south to visit camps and hospitals, listened to briefings, and stood with troops near the front, the only reigning monarch in the Americas to do so. His presence helped sustain morale and kept political factions at home aligned behind the war effort. The conflict drew chroniclers. Photographers and correspondents followed columns, setting up darkrooms and tents and sketching field maps that circulated in Rio and Buenos Aires. The public saw portraits of soldiers, river batteries, and flooded roads, an early form of war reporting that made distant battles feel immediate. Yet the images could not capture the demographic collapse underway. By 1870, Allied forces had broken Paraguay's defenses, pursued Lopez into the interior, and killed him in a final clash. The country that set the war in motion emerged ravaged, with its population cut by more than half, its towns stripped, and its fields empty of working hands. Brazil returned with victory and heavy burdens. Debt climbed, veterans carried scars, and stories of favoritism and corruption in procurement circled through newspapers and officers' clubs. The Army's new cohesion and confidence coexisted with resentment over late pay and political interference. Those tensions would not fade with the parade home. They followed the empire into the next debates over labor, citizenship, and who should command the future. Victory abroad hid strain at home. After the war, the empire carried new debts and a larger army that felt it had earned a political voice. Officers published memoirs, formed clubs, and pressed for promotions based on merit rather than patronage. Their pride in the campaign hardened into a quiet independence from civilian ministers. At the same time, provincial budgets leaned on coffee export taxes, and coffee itself set the rhythm of public life: harvest, shipment, credit, and renewal. Ports thrummed, but the countryside showed the divide. Prosperous estates expanding into Sao Paulo's interior, while freed and enslaved workers crowded the margins of towns. Profit concentrated at the top. Planters refinanced mills, bought modern pulping machines, and ordered more rails to push lines deeper into the highlands. Credit houses in Rio and Santos steered capital towards those who already held land and access. Wages lagged, and urban services struggled to keep pace with migration from the interior. The legal end of the transatlantic trade had not undone the institution. Plantation ledgers still listed men and women as property, and the domestic market moved people southward to coffee zones, breaking households and carving a path for contraband when prices rose. Print culture attacked that order. Editors serialized anti-slavery arguments, lawyers filed freedom suits, and lecturers toured theaters with proceeds earmarked for manumissions. Mutual aid societies and black brotherhoods organized festivities that doubled as fundraisers and forums. The cause reached salons and palace corridors. While the emperor kept his reserve, his daughter stepped into state duties during his absences and received delegations pressing for gradual laws. Petitions multiplied for measures that chipped away at bondage, registries, limits on sales, and protection for the children of enslaved women. Old allies drifted. The church, long integrated into imperial administration, bristled at state involvement in religious affairs and disciplinary matters. Bishops faced legal challenges that made pulpit disputes national news. The army, proud and better trained after the river campaigns, pushed for autonomy in promotions and doctrine. Coffee barons who had financed schools and local charities warned that emancipation without compensation would gut their businesses. Each camp wanted space from the crown, and each found reasons to resist decrees from Rio. The legislative route accelerated. Laws aimed first at new generations and at the elderly, creating pathways out of bondage on paper, then widening the terms. Manumission funds grew. Quilombos persisted in hard terrain, and flight to towns rose as police controls loosened. When the final measure passed, it moved fast through the capital and provinces. Ceremonies erupted with bands and street parades. Plantation ledgers froze, and owners saw assets vanish overnight. Workers searched for wages and land, often landing in the same fields under new contracts, without schooling or relief to smooth the transition. The emperor, aging and often ill, traveled more for treatment and rest, and withdrew from daily bargaining with factions. He remained widely admired abroad and moved through Europe with ease, choosing low profiles that suited his temper. At home, his name still anchored institutions, but the network beneath him had shifted. By the next year, a group of officers and civilians, confident and organized, ended the dynasty without siege or broad bloodshed. The court packed, the flag changed, and the new regime kept the rail timetables running. Dawn broke over the Rio on November 15, 1889, and the empire ended without a firefight. Troops mustered on short notice, officers exchanged brief orders in barracks and ministry courtyards, and the city woke to columns moving toward the center. Residents heard drums and boots rather than rifles. By late morning, the monarchy was finished, and a republic had been declared. No barricades, no street battles, only a firm transfer of authority carried out in daylight. Marshal Deodoro de Fonseca, long respected in the army, stood at the front of the move. He had once praised the emperor's steadiness, but years of disputes over promotions, cabinet intrigue, and policy hesitations turned respect into distance. Senior officers urged him on, arguing that the crown no longer matched the country's needs. He weighed health troubles and personal loyalty against pressure from peers, and then chose to act. The decision gave the movement a face familiar to veterans and provincial garrisons alike. The coalition behind him had been prepared by years of quiet organizing. Republican clubs printed pamphlets, lawyers drafted platforms, and professors hosted debates that spilled from lecture halls into cafes. Coffee magnates, worried about labor after abolition and frustrated with the court's reluctance to recognize their influence, offered funds and local connections. Younger officers, shaped by campaign experience and a merit ethos, found the Republican language of modernization and civic duty persuasive. When the march began, the alignment of ideas, money, and command produced a clean execution. In the streets, the change announced itself with symbols. The new green and yellow flag, familiar in palette but reset with a central sphere and a fresh motto, went up on public buildings as clerks removed imperial emblems from offices. The color continuity softened the visual shock. The message underneath signaled a scientific, orderly future. Municipal workers logged inventory, ministries swapped seals, and telegraph offices relayed notices to provincial capitals. Routine absorbed the rupture. At the palace, the last act unfolded quietly. The emperor, roused early, met officials who spoke in measured tones. He accepted the decision and prepared to leave. No attempt to rally regiments, no appeal to the streets. Carriages rolled, trunks were packed first, and passage to Europe arranged. The royal household, which had anchored ceremonies and patronage for decades, moved off stage with minimal disruption to the workday of the city. Many residents learned of the shift only later. Shopkeepers closed ledgers at dusk and found headlines the next morning announcing a republic already in motion. The absence of gunfire gave the day an odd calm. Tram lines ran, markets opened. A revolution had occurred between office hours. Deodoro took the presidency and formed a provisional government that leaned on the army for stability while drafting new rules. Decrees reorganized ministries, reset provincial authority, and mapped out elections. Currency, customs, and debt arrangements demanded continuity. The state kept them running while the legal framework changed. For outsiders, the signal that a new regime had arrived was the national flag's motto, Ordem e Progresso, lifted from a current of philosophy that prized rational planning. Designers assembled that flag in a matter of days, balancing inheritance and intention. The star map fixed the Republic's imagination on the sky, while the palette anchored it to familiar ground. Behind the scenes, exile settled in for the imperial family. Princess Isabel, central to abolition, did not return, and correspondences with friends shifted to foreign addresses. The new order began with fatigue from the old and confidence in administrative speed. Timetables stayed posted, but the signatures changed, and the next challenge would come from governors learning how to navigate a state without a crown. The Republic began with uniforms and decrees, and then settled into habits set by land and export. Power pooled in Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, where coffee fortunes and cattle wealth funded newspapers, parties, and governors who could move votes county by county. Elections occurred on schedule, but the outcome usually traced the will of men known locally as coronéis, patrons who managed roads, police posts, and payrolls. Ballot boxes traveled with escorts they appointed, and registries listed supporters who owed favors. Congress looked national. The machinery that fed it worked from ranch gates and plantation offices. Café com leche described more than rotation at the presidency. Banks in Sao Paulo discounted planter notes before harvest and extended credit lines to rail syndicates laying track toward the interior. Minas traded cabinet posts and electoral backing for tariff perks, river dredging, and federal works that supported stockyards and dairy routes. In practice, the two states brokered compromises to keep customs revenue steady and interest rates predictable. When droughts hit the Northeast or floods struck the South, relief followed political ties, not always need. Coffee demand kept infrastructure busy. The Sao Paulo Railway crowded with freight. Santos widened wharves, and new lines pushed into the Mogiana and Alta Paulista. Warehouses added mechanical lifts, and exporters synchronized shipments with steamers bound for New York, Hamburg, and Marseille. Municipal councils funded street lighting and piped water as factory belts formed along rail spurs. Workshops turned to machine tools, textiles, and food processing, feeding a growing urban workforce. Rio, now a federal capital without a court, built boulevards and public buildings that matched its role as a hub for customs, finance, and diplomacy. Labor changed as ships unloaded new workers. Italians filled the first waves, followed by Germans and Japanese families who signed contracts for coffee estates or sought wages in town industries. On farms, colonado agreements paid by plot and share, tying families to rows of trees and to the planter's store. In cities, boarding houses and tenements filled near mills and yards. Mutual aid societies offered sickness funds, burial insurance, and language schools, softening the first months of adjustment while shaping neighborhood politics. Federalism widened the space for local bosses. Governors controlled state police, built road concessions, and negotiated tax deals that favored allies. The center relied on Senate pacts to pass budgets. States bargained for exemptions in federal works. This autonomy produced a map of enclaves where courts followed the lead of patrons and strikes met quick repression. Wages fell behind rents, and food prices spiked with currency swings, driving workers into new associations that tested the old order. By the 1910s, ideas arrived with pamphlets and returned migrants. Anarchist organizers printed small papers, called general strikes, and trained in mutual schools that taught literacy and the language of rights. Socialist clubs debated municipal ownership and labor laws. The first unions cut their teeth on streetcar, dock, and textile stoppages. Police raided halls and deported foreigners, but the structure of collective action held, especially in Sao Paulo's factory districts. Abroad, Brazil sought recognition in forums that measured modern states, entering the League of Nations in 1919. At home, officials tried to tame commodity cycles by buying surplus coffee and, when storage failed, burning sacks to hold up prices. The tactic saved balance sheets but inflamed criticism during lean years. As the 1920s wore on, harvests outpaced demand, and world markets rattled. Young officers staged uprisings, students talked reform, and provincial coalitions frayed. By the end of the decade, a politician from Rio Grande do Sul built a cross-state ticket around tariff relief, social legislation, and a harder line against the old broker system, and the march toward confrontation gathered steam. The old broker politics cracked in 1930. Regional coalitions split after a contested election, and a cross-state alliance marched on the capital with sympathetic officers. Getúlio Vargas, a shrewd governor from Rio Grande do Sul, took the helm with military backing and began to govern by decree. He suspended the routines that had favored coffee oligarchs and wrote a new playbook from the presidential palace. Ministries multiplied, technocrats drafted codes, and federal inspectors arrived in states that had once acted like small republics. Vargas built a base by presenting himself as the protector of workers while courting factory owners who needed order and infrastructure. He centralized the collection of revenues and sent federal interventionists to replace state governors when conflicts flared. New boards regulated currency, customs, and industrial standards. The government mapped railway junctions to industrial zones and steered credit to steel, textiles, and food processing. Ports gained cranes, warehouses, and customs scanners that quickened throughput. Tariffs, subsidies, and exchange controls shielded infant industries, while price policies tried to cushion coffee's booms and busts. Labor policy anchored his popularity. The state recognized unions through a licensing system, linked dues to payroll, and required employers to register hires. The modern labor card appeared on shop floors and in offices, tying benefits to documented work history. A minimum wage, overtime rules, and paid rest days entered everyday calculations for factories and workshops. Labor courts settled disputes with a paper trail that brought foremen, lawyers, and inspectors into the same room. Gained new leverage, but union independence narrowed because the ministry could suspend leaders and decertify locals that defied directives. With Brasilia decades away, Rio served as the stage for a crafted national identity. Radio networks carried speeches, music, and serial dramas that stitched together audiences from Amazon towns to coastal suburbs. Film institutes promoted newsreels of factories, harvests, and civic parades. Textbooks standardized civics lessons that paired maps, industries, and a forward-looking national story. Architects and urban planners used public works to signal modern competence. Avenues widened, public buildings adopted cleaner lines, and utilities expanded as symbols of discipline and progress. In 1937, facing polarization and citing plots, Vargas canceled elections, dissolved Congress, and announced the Estado Novo. Censorship tightened. Newspapers ran with blank spaces or revised editorials. Opposition parties closed their doors. Police intelligence units grew, and special tribunals handled political cases. The Constitution was replaced with a charter that concentrated executive powers, extended states of emergency, and kept the bureaucracy busy issuing decrees that touched school curricula, press licenses, and factory safety inspections. Authoritarianism and modernization traveled together, each reinforcing the other's reach. When war broke out in Europe, Brazil maintained neutrality while selling goods and bargaining for equipment. After U-boat attacks in the South Atlantic, the government sided with the Allies in 1942. Airfields, ports, and communications became strategic assets in hemispheric defense. Brazil raised and trained an expeditionary force that fought in Italy alongside U.S. and Allied units. An overseas campaign that pushed logistics, medical services, and command structures to a new level. At home, steel production expanded, and wartime contracts knitted Brazilian industry into broader supply chains. By 1945, the tide had turned abroad and at home. Wartime mobilization expanded the middle ranks of the military and bureaucracy, and returning officers pressed for elections and civil guarantees. Civil groups called for legality and an end to decree rule. Under growing pressure, Vargas stepped aside, leaving behind industrial plants, a labor relations framework, a stronger central state, and a population used to hearing national policy on the radio at set hours. The tools he forged would outlast his fall, shaping how governments, parties, and unions would bargain in the decades to come. The democratic opening after 1945 brought elections, parties, and a freer press back into daily life. But the ground under those institutions kept shifting. Cities swelled as people left rural zones for factory jobs and public service work, and ministries learned to govern a faster, more urban country. Budgets leaned toward power plants, highways, and housing, while parties stitched coalitions that depended on trucking guilds, union locals, and governors who could deliver votes. Inflation lurked, strikes tested police responses, and Congress worked through long nights to keep fragile agreements intact. The Fourth Republic rebuilt procedures, ballots returned on schedule, and a new generation of politicians learned to negotiate cabinet seats around economic plans. Industrial belts expanded around Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, and Rio, bringing machine shops, car assembly, and petrochemicals into the mix. Radio and print widened debate, and courts handled electoral disputes that once would have fallen to provincial bosses. Urban planning became a national conversation as neighborhoods sprawled into new suburbs tied together by buses and paved arteries. Vargas re-entered that world by winning the 1950 vote and took office in early 1951. He revived state-led development, pushed for control of key sectors, and backed wage policies that spoke to workers squeezed by rising prices. Business lobbies, conservative parties, and major newspapers countered with charges of waste, politicized unions, and creeping statism. The standoff hardened as inflation rose and street rallies grew larger. Under severe pressure in 1954, the presidency ended in a national shock that produced days of mourning and a wave of public sympathy strong enough to unsettle his fiercest critics. A new emphasis on growth followed. Juscelino Kubitschek, elected in 1955 and taking office in 1956, promised rapid advance and delivered projects that reorganized the map. Federal highways connected inland towns to coastal ports, dams fed grids that powered factories, and an auto industry took shape with foreign manufacturers setting up plants under protection. The most visible piece was Brasilia, a planned capital built at speed on a high plateau, which pulled civil servants and contractors hundreds of miles from the coast and signaled a bet on the interior. The effort demanded moving tens of thousands of workers to a worksite that became a city in just 41 months. Growth had costs that mounted as the decade closed. Imports for machinery and fuel strained foreign accounts, consumer demand ran ahead of supply, and inflation ate into salaries. Labor federations pressed for adjustments, while students and professionals called for broader social reform. The military watched these tensions and mapped contingency plans amid Cold War alarms. U.S. diplomats and officers tracked events closely, linking aid packages to policy signals and treating the country as a key node in hemispheric security. João Goulart, a longtime ally of Vargas, entered the presidency after crisis and compromise. He pushed a program that mixed land redistribution, higher minimum wages, and partial nationalizations with proposals to regulate foreign remittances. Governors split, Congress stalled, and markets wobbled as rallies for and against the plan filled downtown avenues. Food prices climbed, rent strikes spread, and some unions announced general stoppages. Officers split into currents, with moderate commands overshadowed by hardline groups that saw a narrowing window to act. In early 1964, demonstrations, countermarches, and mutinies converged. Naval units signaled defiance, business groups funded logistics, and church networks mobilized street support. Warships from abroad moved into position under a pre-planned operation, while armored columns advanced with little resistance. The president left office, broadcasts announced calm, and a new regime installed itself promising order and development through control rather than debate. The new regime called the 1964 takeover a corrective revolution and set about rewriting rules. Decrees suspended constitutional guarantees, generals appointed state governors, and a rolling series of institutional acts tightened control. Parties were shut, rebranded, and folded into a managed two-party structure that kept ballots but clipped choices. Congress stayed open on paper, yet key laws moved by command. Intelligence branches expanded under national security laws that defined dissent as subversion. Police units built networks of informants, and coordination with Allied services tracked students, clergy, and union leaders across borders. Censorship arrived in layers. Editors received phone calls with forbidden topics, film boards cut scenes, and theater scripts returned with lines struck out. Journalists weighed wording that might pass midnight reviews. Professors lost posts, and textbooks were revised to stress discipline and economic planning. Courts prosecuted crimes against national security, a broad category that covered leaflets, meetings, and songs. Thousands were detained, many pushed into exile, and some vanished into interrogation centers that operated behind innocuous facades. A map of fear spread through cities where an ordinary office door could hide a cell. Yet cranes and bulldozers also filled skylines. From the late 1960s into the 1970s, growth surged as loans and foreign capital funded steel mills, petrochemicals, dams, and expressways. Companies set up assembly lines under tariff walls that promised market share if they produced locally. Cities added overpasses and towers. Ports installed container equipment. The power grid stretched into new regions. Statistics made nightly news, celebrating output, kilowatts, and paved kilometers. The miracle raised incomes for some and expanded a consumer market for appliances and cars. The gains were uneven. Wage controls and curbs on strikes held labor costs low, while inflation ate purchasing power. In the countryside, mechanization and land concentration pushed families towards cities that could not house them. Favelas grew along hillsides and floodplains, where buses reached but sanitation lagged. The state lifted flagship industries, but schools and clinics trailed. Economic ministries targeted growth rates. Social services absorbed the overflow without catching up. Culture found ways to push back. Students marched, were dispersed, regrouped, and formed study circles. Underground newspapers used small presses and rotating addresses. Musicians and artists layered meanings to slip past censors who banned certain words, images, and even colors. Tropicalia wove electric guitars, northeastern rhythms, and urban irony into songs that carried critique under playful surfaces. When works drew attention, arrests and forced departures followed. Yet the blend of experimentation and coded dissent left a mark that endured beyond the crackdowns. By the mid-1970s, the security apparatus reached its peak, then faced fatigue and scrutiny. Allegations of torture, once whispered, circulated more openly. Some officials argued that repression had achieved its objective and risked delegitimizing the state if it continued unchanged. A controlled easing began. The government loosened press rules, restored some political rights, and allowed cautious competition within the managed party system. The pace stayed uneven, with reversals after bombings and scandals, but the direction tilted toward opening. Economic headwinds hastened the shift. Oil shocks raised import bills, debt piled up, and inflation returned with force. Growth slowed, layoffs mounted, and middle-class patience thinned. Civic groups organized petitions, church networks hosted forums, and professional associations coordinated campaigns for electoral reform. The Direitos Já wave drew crowds in plazas across the country, combining concerts, speeches, and legal proposals that centered on one demand: direct national elections. Though the immediate bid failed, the pressure forced a political transition on the regime's terms, but to a civilian finish. In 1985, the transfer occurred without a civil war, and the country stepped into a new phase that would test how to rebuild rights after 2 decades of rule by decree. Democracy returned in 1985 after 2 decades of generals, and the transition opened with restraint rather than rupture. An indirect electoral college chose Tancredo Neves to lead the handover, a compromise figure acceptable to opposition and parts of the regime. Illness struck before inauguration, and he died, leaving a vacuum at the threshold. José Sarney, his vice president and a former ally of the old order who had crossed over, took office. He faced a state with inflated budgets, index contracts that fed price spirals, and a public hungry for rights and stability. His administration restored political freedoms, legalized parties, and convened a constituent assembly to write new rules while battling hyperinflation that reset grocery prices between paydays. The assembly finished its work in 1988. The charter broadened social guarantees, set term limits, decentralized funds to municipalities, and reasserted civilian supremacy over the armed forces. It expanded the role of prosecutors and public defenders, created new oversight bodies, and set out environmental protections. Courts gained tools to hear collective actions, and social policy moved onto a constitutional footing. The framework was ambitious and expensive, and it landed on an economy still spinning. Price freezes, currency swaps, and wage guidelines cycled through without lasting success, and corruption scandals eroded patience. Even so, civic groups, investigative reporters, and neighborhood associations gained influence as media and public debate flourished. Stability arrived in stages during the 1990s. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, first as finance minister and then president, replaced indexation with the real plan, anchored expectations with a new unit of account, and tightened fiscal policy. A central bank with clearer mandates gained credibility. Privatizations and regulatory agencies restructured telecoms, mining, electricity, and ports. Trade liberalization lowered tariffs and integrated supply chains, while social indicators began to track improvements in schooling and vaccination. The currency held, inflation fell to single digits, and credit returned on terms the Treasury could manage. The 2000s shifted the focus to inclusion. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva took office with a pledge to maintain macroeconomic anchors while expanding income support. Conditional cash transfers consolidated into Bolsa Familia, tying benefits to school attendance and health checkups. A rising minimum wage, formal job growth, and commodity demand from abroad lifted incomes and consumption, especially in smaller cities. New universities and federal institutes opened seats to first-generation students, and housing programs extended mortgages to low-income families. Brazil's global profile rose with diplomacy in the Global South and bids to host major events. The cycle turned harder in the following decade. Corruption probes uncovered schemes in state-linked firms and contracting networks, ensnaring parties and executives. A recession hit, commodities slumped, and fiscal gaps widened. Political coalitions fractured, and Congress advanced impeachment against President Dilma Rousseff in 2016, ending her term and deepening polarization. Populist currents gained control, social media amplified conflict, and security concerns climbed with homicide spikes in some regions. Institutions absorbed the shocks. Courts adjudicated cases at the highest levels. Electoral authorities ran tight races, and independent media covered every turn. One detail from the constitutional moment stands out. The 1988 document earned the nickname the Citizen Constitution for its breadth, with hundreds of articles on rights and duties. Another marker came from the global stage. The 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Rio Olympics drew the world's attention and tested logistics, budgets, and public trust in grand projects. Through swings in policy and fortune, the country kept competitive elections, a decentralized federation, and a culture that sent music, film, and sport across borders. By the third decade of the century, the long arc, from indigenous polities to republic, rested on a public that expects a vote, a voice, and institutions that can weather another turn of the cycle. Profit had drawn the borders. A company chasing sugar profits built forts, books, and a coastline worth defending. Money ruled before laws, and contracts bound more than treaties ever did. So when trade turns violent, who really shapes a nation? Voters or investors? Keep that in mind as we move inland, where gold replaces sugar and fortunes shift. If you're enjoying the journey through Brazil's past, hit subscribe. There's more history ahead.